when F9F Panthers AT Soviet MiG-15s. The sky over Korea did not care about politics. It did not recognize borders, ideologies, or secret agreements. It only knew speed, altitude, and firepower. In that thin, frozen air above the Yalu River, American naval pilots flying stub-nosed, jets from aircraft carriers would clash with sleek, Soviet-designed fighters flown by men who officially did not exist. History would later remember the MiG-15 as a killer of bombers, a terror of the skies, but for a brief, violent moment something unexpected happened. Something historians rarely talk about. The Grumman F9F Panther, slow, heavy, underestimated, began hunting MiGs. Not in theory, not on paper, in real dogfights, with real pilots dying. This is the untold story of how Navy Panthers challenged and sometimes destroyed the most feared jet fighter of the early Cold War, a war nobody wanted, a sky full of lies. 1,000 words. When the Korean War erupted in June 1950, the United States was not prepared for a jet war. Not really. World War II had ended only 5 years earlier, and most American pilots still thought in terms of propellers, dive angles, and turning fights. Jet combat was new, unpredictable, and brutally unforgiving. The Navy, in particular, entered the conflict with a problem that few wanted to admit. Its best jet fighter was already considered obsolete. The Grumman F9F Panther was never meant to dominate the skies over Asia. It was designed for carrier operations, short takeoffs, heavy landings, and reliability at sea. It was thick-winged, straight-lined, and slower than the Air Force's sleek new jets. On paper, it had no business facing the MiG-15, a swept-wing monster that could climb faster, fly higher, and escape almost at will. Yet history has a habit of ignoring paper. The MiG myth begins. The MiG-15 arrived over Korea like a ghost. Silver, fast, and deadly. It shocked American commanders when it first appeared in late 1950. These jets weren't flown by poorly trained North Korean pilots, as many had expected. They were flown by elite aviators, men with perfect formation, discipline, and aggressive tactics. Unofficially, many of them were Soviet pilots. Officially, the United States was not fighting the Soviet Union. This lie shaped everything. MiGs attacked in groups, diving from high altitude, firing once, then climbing away where few American aircraft could follow. B-29 bombers, once untouchable, were ripped apart. The Air Force rushed the F-86 Sabre into the fight, but the Navy had no such luxury. Its carriers were already at sea. Its squadrons were already committed, and they flew Panthers. The Panther's reputation? A flying target. The Panther was solid, stable, and deadly at low to medium altitude. It carried 4 20mm cannons, devastating if they hit. But against the MiG-15, it seemed hopelessly outclassed. The MiG could outclimb it by thousands of feet per minute. It could dive away. It could disengage whenever it chose. Every Navy pilot knew this, which made what happened next all the more terrifying, because MiGs did not always fight smart. Carrier decks and cold steel nerves. From the decks of carriers like USS Valley Forge, USS Princeton, and USS Philippine Sea, Panther pilots launched into a war that felt strangely one-sided. They weren't chasing glory. They were protecting strike aircraft, escorting bombers, and providing close air support for Marines pinned down in frozen valleys. They flew long missions over enemy territory with no margin for error. A single engine flameout meant capture or death. And then, over northern Korea, the MiGs came down to them. The first shock. In November 1950, Panther pilots reported MiGs diving aggressively into lower altitudes, exactly where Panthers were strongest. These weren't hit-and-run attacks. These were turning fights, knife-range dogfights. Some MiG pilots were overconfident. Others were inexperienced Chinese pilots newly trained on Soviet jets. And sometimes the rules of jet combat broke down completely. The Panther's heavy airframe suddenly became an advantage. Where MiGs bled energy in tight turns, Panthers held steady. Where MiGs overshot, Panthers stayed controlled. Navy pilots learned quickly, don't chase, force the MiG to fight your fight. Lieutenant Commander William Amen. The moment, everything changed. On November 9, 1950, Lieutenant CMDR William T. Amen of VF-111 spotted a MiG-15 while flying an F9F2 Panther. The MiG had altitude. It had speed. It should have escaped easily. Instead, it turned. What followed was the first jet versus jet kill by a Navy pilot in history. Amen stayed low, forced the MiG into a descending turn, and when the enemy pilot tried to pull up, the Panther's cannons spoke. The MiG disintegrated in midair. The shockwaves went far beyond the wreckage. The Panther had killed a MiG, and it wouldn't be the last. A dangerous truth spreads. Word spread quietly through Navy squadrons. The Panther wasn't helpless. It just needed patience, discipline, teamwork. Pilots began flying in pairs and fours, setting traps. One Panther would act as bait, staying visible and vulnerable. When a MiG dove, another Panther would cut across the turn, firing from below and behind, the MiG's weakest angle. These were not heroic solo duels. They were calculated ambushes. The enemy adapts, and so does the lie. MiG losses mounted. Soviet commanders noticed. Orders were issued: avoid low-altitude engagements. Do not dogfight Panthers. Stick to boom and zoom tactics. But the damage was done. Soviet pilots began dying at the hands of men flying jets the West itself considered inferior, and officially, none of it was happening. If a Soviet pilot was shot down, he was listed as missing. If a MiG crashed, it was mechanical failure. Fear in the cockpit. Despite the victories, Panther pilots knew the odds. One mistake meant death. The MiG-15 was still faster, still deadlier at altitude. Every engagement felt like rolling loaded dice. Yet they kept flying, in freezing cockpits, over enemy territory, against pilots who were not supposed to exist. And with every mission, the myth of MiG invincibility cracked just a little more. The sky is no longer safe. By early 1951, something strange had happened over Korea. The MiG-15 was still feared, but no longer untouchable. The F9F Panther, once dismissed as a naval compromise, had earned respect the hard way. But the deadliest encounters were still to come, because soon the MiGs would return in force. And this time, they would come looking for Panthers, hunting in the jet age, when Panthers turned the tables. By the spring of 1951, the skies over Korea had changed their personality. What began as cautious encounters between unfamiliar machines had evolved into a brutal contest of experience, nerves, and adaptation. The MiG-15 was still faster, still higher, still theoretically superior, but theory had begun to crack under the weight of reality. Navy Panther pilots were no longer reacting. They were anticipating, and anticipation is lethal in air combat. The Grumman F9F Panther had found its role, not as a pure interceptor, but as a predator of opportunity. Where the MiG relied on altitude dominance, the Panther thrived in chaos. Low clouds, broken formations, and sudden turns where speed meant nothing if you overshot your target. The war in the air was no longer about who had the better aircraft. It was about who made the first mistake. MiG Alley, a trap in the sky. The stretch of airspace near the Yalu River became known as MiG Alley, and the name itself carried dread. This was where MiGs waited, climbing above American formations like sharks beneath the surface. Air Force Sabres tangled with them daily. But Navy Panthers entered this space with a different mission and a different mindset. Panthers were escorting attack aircraft, slow-moving sky raiders and bomb-laden jets that MiGs loved to pounce on. To the MiG pilots, Panthers looked like easy kills, fat, straight-winged jets stuck guarding weaker prey. That perception was deadly, because Panther pilots had learned to weaponize patience. They stayed low. They stayed tight. They stayed quiet on the radio. And when a MiG dove too deep, too fast, too confident, Panthers closed the trap. The energy game, where MiGs bled and Panthers survived. Jet combat introduced a cruel truth: that propeller pilots had never faced so brutally. Once you lost energy, you were already dead. You just didn't know it yet. MiG-15 pilots loved vertical maneuvers. They dove hard, fired once, and climbed steeply back to safety. But when Panthers refused to chase upward, MiGs were forced to stay low if they wanted a kill, and low altitude stripped the MiG of its greatest advantage. The Panther, heavy and stable, could turn without hemorrhaging speed. Its straight wings gave it predictable handling. In sustained turns, MiG pilots found themselves overshooting, sliding past their targets with no firing solution. That single moment, overshoot, was all a Panther needed. 4 20mm cannons firing together did not wound. They erased. The T. Royce Williams, the fight nobody was supposed to know about. On November 18, 1952, one of the most extraordinary jet battles in history unfolded and then vanished into classified silence. Lieutenant Royce Williams, flying an F9F Panther from USS Oriskany, encountered not one MiG, not 2 but 7 MiG-15s. These were not Chinese pilots. These were Soviets, flying aggressively, coordinating perfectly, hunting him. For over 30 minutes, the sky became a spinning nightmare. Williams fought alone. He dove, he climbed. He turned until his vision blurred and his aircraft shook under stress it was never designed to endure. One by one, he caught MiGs making mistakes, diving too steeply, turning too tightly, trusting speed instead of position. Williams shot down 4 MiG-15s. His Panther limped home, shredded, nearly unflyable. He landed by instinct alone. And then he was told never to speak of it. The United States could not admit that Soviet pilots had been shot down by a Navy jet. The incident vanished into classified files for decades. But the truth remained in wreckage scattered across North Korea. Fear cuts both ways. As Panther kills mounted, something subtle shifted in MiG behavior. They became cautious, hesitant, they disengaged sooner. They avoided prolonged fights. This fear wasn't irrational. MiG pilots knew the Panther couldn't chase them, but they also knew it didn't need to. All it needed was for you to turn once too many times. Carrier warfare versus homeland defense. MiG pilots flew from protected bases across the Chinese border. They could retreat, refuel, and return. Panther pilots did not have that luxury. They flew hundreds of miles from pitching carrier decks in brutal weather, often landing with barely enough fuel to stay airborne. Every mission carried exhaustion before combat even began, and still they fought, because if Panthers failed, Marines on the ground died. The guns matter. The MiG-15 carried heavy cannons, deadly but slow firing. The Panther's 4 20mm guns offered a balance of velocity and destruction. At close range, they were surgical. One short burst could cripple a jet instantly. Panther pilots learned to wait, to fire only when the enemy filled the gun sight. In jet combat, seconds mattered. In Panther combat, discipline mattered more. The psychological collapse of the inferior fighter. By late 1952, the narrative was quietly unraveling. Intelligence reports acknowledged MiG losses at low altitude were higher than expected. Soviet commanders rotated pilots more frequently. Training doctrines shifted. The Panther, never designed to dominate, had done something far more dangerous. It had forced adaptation, and adaptation in war means admission of weakness, the war no one could admit. The sky over Korea was now a place of mutual fear. MiGs still hunted, Panthers still guarded, but the certainty was gone. Every dive could be a mistake. Every turn could be fatal. The jet age had arrived, not as a clean technological revolution, but as a brutal learning curve written in burning metal. And yet, the final chapter remained. Because the war was nearing its end, and both sides were about to learn what victory really cost. Silence after. The guns, the legacy of Panthers versus MiGs. When the guns finally fell silent over Korea in July 1953, the sky did not celebrate. There were no victory parades in the clouds, no clear winners drifting down on contrails. What remained were wrecked aircraft buried in frozen hillsides, classified reports locked away in steel cabinets, and pilots who returned home carrying memories they were never allowed to share. The Korean War ended not with triumph, but with an armistice, a pause in history rather than a conclusion. And in that uneasy silence, the story of the F9F Panther versus the MiG-15 was quietly pushed into the shadows. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was too dangerous to admit. A war officially unfought. Publicly, the Korean War was a limited conflict. Privately, it was the first real confrontation between two nuclear-armed superpowers. Every aircraft lost carried political weight. Every pilot shot down risked escalation beyond control. This was why Panther victories over MiGs, especially those flown by Soviet pilots, were buried. To acknowledge them was to admit the unthinkable. Americans and Soviets had already been killing each other in the sky. So records were altered. Kill claims were downplayed. Names were redacted. Pilots were congratulated quietly. Medals awarded behind closed doors. Citations written in careful language that avoided naming the enemy. The war ended. The truth stayed classified. The Panther's quiet exit. The Grumman F9F Panther did not become a legend like the F-86 Sabre. It didn't star in recruitment, posters, or Cold War propaganda. Within a few years, it was replaced by swept-wing successors like the F9F Cougar, designed to match the MiG on equal aerodynamic terms. But replacement did not mean failure. It meant evolution. The Panther had done its job at the most dangerous moment possible during the chaotic birth of jet warfare. It had proven that naval aviation could survive, adapt, and fight effectively in a jet age many believed belonged only to the Air Force. And it had done so against the best the Soviet Union could secretly deploy. The pilots who carried the truth. For decades, men like Royce Williams lived normal lives while carrying extraordinary secrets. They watched history being written without their names. They saw documentaries that never mentioned their battles. They heard the MiG-15 praised as unstoppable, knowing what they had seen through a gun sight at 600 knots. Some never spoke at all. Others tried and were told to stay quiet. Only in the late Cold War did fragments begin to surface. Declassified documents, quiet interviews, acknowledgments buried in footnotes. The realization that Navy pilots flying straight-winged Panthers had achieved something no one expected. They had broken the myth. The MiG legacy reconsidered. The MiG-15 remains a brilliant aircraft. It changed air combat forever. It forced the West to innovate, adapt, and accelerate technological development. But history, once corrected, tells a more complex story. The MiG did not dominate because it was invincible. It dominated because it arrived early, and because it was flown aggressively. When faced by disciplined opponents who understood its weaknesses, it could be beaten. And sometimes, it was beaten by an aircraft it was never supposed to fear. Lessons written in fire. The true legacy of Panther versus MiG is not about kill ratios or technical specifications. It is about adaptation under pressure, about pilots learning faster than doctrine, about human judgment triumphing over theoretical superiority. Modern air combat doctrine, energy management, situational awareness, teamwork was forged in those frozen Korean skies. Mistakes were paid for instantly. Success was often invisible, and the men who learned those lessons carried them forward into future wars. The Cold War moves on. As Korea faded from headlines, the Cold War intensified. New jets appeared, missiles replaced guns, radar replaced eyesight, the kind of close-range dogfights. Panthers fought became rarer, but never irrelevant. Every time a pilot trains for a visual engagement, every time rules of engagement demand identification before firing, the ghost of Korea lingers, because technology changes. Human error does not. The final irony. Perhaps the greatest irony of all is this. The F9F Panther was never meant to eat MiGs. It was meant to defend fleets, support Marines, survive carrier landings. Yet in doing exactly what it was designed to do, being stable, reliable, and forgiving, it became lethal in the hands of skilled pilots. Not because it was faster, but because it allowed men to think clearly under pressure. Closing scene. Imagine the Korean sky one last time. High above, contrails fade. Wreckage rusts below. The war pauses, but never truly ends. And somewhere in that silence, the Panther's story waits. Not loud, not celebrated, but undeniable. Because for a brief, violent chapter of history, the F9F Panther hunted the MiG-15. The Korean sky is quiet now. No contrails cut through the clouds. No cannons flash in frozen air. But silence does not mean the story is over. Because buried beneath declassified files and forgotten dogfights is a truth few were meant to. You know that sometimes victory does not belong to the fastest jet, but to the pilot who refuses to panic when everything goes wrong. The F9F Panther was never supposed to win. It was heavier, slower, outdated on paper. Yet in the hands of disciplined naval aviators, it shattered one of the Cold War's earliest myths that the MiG-15 ruled the skies uncontested. These men fought a war they could not admit. They defeated an enemy they could not name. And they returned home with victories they were never allowed to celebrate. History remembers the machines, but it is the pilots who change the war. And sometimes, the most dangerous weapon in the sky is not speed, not altitude, but calm under fire. If you want more untold air combat stories like this, stories history books skip and archives tried to hide, subscribe to the channel, because the next battle is already waiting. And tell us in the comments, which jet duel should we uncover next?